Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer and 40k lore. Normally, the first Friday of the month is reserved for Warhammer Fantasy, but today I've got a bit of a unique combo for you, because we are going to be talking about Malal / Malice, the Chaos God of Order, and more correctly, in modern day terms, the Chaos God of Anti-Chaos. Now, immediately I hear some exclamation and question marks popping up above the heads of many of you. Hold on there, Arch. A Chaos God of Anti-Chaos? That sounds mildly self-contradictory, and yes, you would be entirely correct. But this is a thing that stems all the way back to, 1984, I believe, and the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy, before Warhammer even really became recognizable as the Warhammer Fantasy of today, which only happened in the 4th and 5th edition in the early 90s. By the by, 4th and 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy are still the absolute best editions of Warhammer Fantasy, both in terms of style and general design. It was just the just right mix of wacky and serious. The art was bright, bold, and full of contrast, and yet still simultaneously dark, depressing, and moody. It was just perfect. But I am digressing somewhat, am I not? This is a tangled web, to put it mildly. So what I'm going to do is, I will start out with the lore, beginning in 40k, then moving on to Warhammer, and then at the end, I'll talk about why Malal is no longer technically canon, whilst Malice technically is, although they are also technically the same entity. It involves a handful of accusations of plagiarism and legal disputes. Disputes of such a serious nature that even GW's overly trigger-happy legal team shied away from them. And finally, as one last aside, I promise, you may remember in the Starship Troopers lore video I made last week, I mentioned that I'd be turning on YouTube subscribers options. And then YouTube decided to be YouTube, but it should finally be on now. So if you want to support me via a reoccurring $5 monthly fee, then you will get access to the lore videos one day early on Thursday, and you also get access to some special icons and chat emotes as well. And mostly it's just kind of I feel bad for turning on ad block, but the ads are incredibly annoying, so this is an alternative means of support. At least, that's how I'm primarily using the feature right now. But enough waffling around the porridge, let us finally get into it, shall we? And our story begins in the far-flung future of the 41st millennium with a loyalist space marine chapter known as the Sons of Malice. Or at least that is the only name we know them by. They may have been called something else in the distant past, but after a series of unfortunate circumstances, which, to be fair, were not entirely their own faults, their names have since been stricken from all Imperial records, as they have been labelled excommunicatus traitoris. But before that unfortunate series of happenstances, and one overly inquisitive inquisitor, they were a part of the Astartes Praeses, a series of 20 Space Marine chapters formed specifically for the duty of guarding the Eye of Terror and protecting the wider Imperium against any further invasions from that particular nasty part. Now, a station near the Eye of Terror is a, precarious one, at the best of times for even the most steadfast and loyal chapters. There are many a Space Marine force that has fallen either to battlefield casualties, the vagaries of warp travel simply disappearing, being lost for all eternity in an immaterial squall, being torn apart by hordes of traitors and heretics, or falling to altogether more corruptive, subtle, and seductive forms of manipulations. The only way for a good Imperial servant to remain as such near the Eye of Terror is to continuously rededicate one's mind, heart, and soul to the Imperial purpose, and clad oneself in the armor of hatred. And even then, that was no guarantee. But as for the Sons of Malice, well, they were always quite the unorthodox chapter. None questioned their efficiency. They were as brutal and effective a fighting force as nearly any Astartes chapter. But their traditions, one particular peculiarity that they had adopted at some point along the way. Mind you that we do not know from which legion they originally hailed, but they clearly did consider themselves to some degree hunters, which may potentially be an indication. They would gather, you see, captives and prisoners of war, a very unusual thing for Astartes to do, particularly in the vicinity of the Eye of Terror. It would be rather unlikely for the Sons to be dispatched on a campaign where the Administratum for some reason or another demanded that they show mercy. And even if there were, for some strange happenstance, to be the case, chapters do not maintain prisoner of war camps. Feeding, housing, caring for, and potentially utilizing POWs is a pretty darn considerable logistical undertaking, well beyond the capacity of the average Codex-compliant chapter of 1,000 battle brothers. And even if we were to assume that they would have their serfs take care of the prisoners, a logical inference, how many prisoners could they really take care of? Bearing in mind, again, they'd have to feed them, they'd have to water them, they'd have to keep them alive, with medicine, with quarters, and probably find something productive for them to do as well, since prisoners with nothing to do, particularly during times of war, and considering the likely nature of prisoners taken in the Eye of Terror, I imagine they would very quickly become somewhat rowdy. And furthermore on that point, what use would the Sons of Malice have for prisoners? Labor, perhaps? Slave workers aboard their warships? A common enough practice within the Imperial Navy? No, that was not the purpose. As I've already hinted at, it had more to do with traditions. Once every 11 years, a important number, which we will get to a little bit later, the Sons would all return, the entire chapter full strength, to their home world of Skelos, where they would engage in a massive ritualistic celebration, where all the prisoners would be sacrificed and eaten by the Sons. Alright, one of those types of Space Marine chapters. I see. Now, you may remember not that long ago I did do a video on the Mortifactors, a loyalist chapter, still loyalist chapter, that does have a somewhat similar tradition. And again, bear in mind, the eating of a defeated foe's flesh is not necessarily a purely superstitious or ritualistic thing for the Space Marines. They have a unique organ that is actually able to absorb a portion of the memories and the skills of whomever they eat. And over the years, the centuries, the millennia, this practical part of the Astartes biology has, for many chapters, evolved into something more, spiritual, in the best case scenario, or more enjoyable, in the worst case scenario. The point is, the mere devouring of one's defeated opponent is not in and of itself a surefire sign of heretical corruption. Now sure, you would be hard-pressed to find a member of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition that would tell you it's a good sign, but once more, the Adeptus Astartes must be allowed the occasional eccentricity. Regrettably, this memo had not apparently been forwarded to Inquisitor Pietus, who had joined the Sons of Malice in the Kilix 225 campaign against heretical forces. The ragtag band of Chaos Zealots proved no problem whatsoever for the Sons of Malice, who made short work out of them, but then during their victory celebrations, where they were led in their usual live sacrifices and deviant dietary desires by Captain Catal of the First Company, the inquisitive Inquisitor was right there to witness it all. Now again, as I did mention in the Mortifactors video, there have been Inquisitors present at their own banquets on multiple occasions, and yet nothing has ever come of it, at the very least. Nothing violent. So why should this be any different? Well, the simple fact is, Inquisitors are given more or less carte blanche to act in any way they see fit at their own discretion, virtually entirely. The only authority that could possibly try or intervene in an Inquisitor's decision is a Lord Inquisitor, and those are few and far between. Having come to the conclusion that these actions were deviant and heretical in the extreme, Inquisitor Pietus decided to abandon the victory celebration and instead organize a strike force of Adepta Sororitas to deal with the deviant heretics. Awfully convenient for him that there was a strike force of Sisters of Battle nearby, but this was at the end of a planetary campaign against Chaos Zealots, so it would stand to reason that there would be other Imperial forces nearby too. And they certainly were close, because after the Inquisitor had left the celebrations, he then was able to organize the strike force and immediately launch an attack upon the Sons in the middle of their still ongoing celebrations. Now, it might just be me, but I cannot help but conjure up the mental image of buckets of fried chicken launching a deep strike assault on the annual gathering of the 500 pounds plus and proud coalition of competitive eaters. And just like in that hopefully fictional scenario, the Sisters' assault on the Sons was both gross, with chicken fat and tendies flying through the air in all directions, and awfully predictable. The first Captain Catal even had the leeway to ensure that none of his now kinda fired up and a little bit over-eager subjects took any premature bites out of the Inquisitor's delectable little rump roast, saving that pleasure for himself, dragging him up to the central sacrifice altar, and ritualistically offered up the Inquisitor to, at this point, considering they were still loyal, presumably the God Emperor. I wonder what Big E must have thought at that point. On the one hand, I appreciate the dedication. On the other, don't you think you might have gone a hint far with this one, my boy? At least the rest of the Imperium certainly seemed to think so. Now, it is not entirely unheard of for a Space Marine chapter to accident, the occasionally overly nosy inquisitor, but it is usually understood that if such measures are necessary, they should be done with a degree of, subtlety and deniability, and not in the form of a late-night barbecue. Even if the Inquisition and the Imperium wanted to ignore this, again, it would be one thing if it was just the Inquisitor being strained through the digestive system of a couple hundred superhumans, but when you add in God only knows how many Sisters of Battle on top of that awful tally, it gets somewhat difficult, does it not? And so swiftly thereafter, the Sons of Malice were declared traitors to the Imperium and forced to flee into the Eye of Terror. Subsequently, an investigation was launched into the chapter's background, and particularly as well, its home world of Skelos, to try and figure out what had gone so horribly wrong here. The theory was that the chapter had adopted many of the less than entirely tasteful, pun intended, traditions of the feral population of the planet of Skelos, where apparently cannibalism and ritualistic sacrifice to an hitherto unknown deity that they had at first thought was merely some local interpretation of the Emperor, though after this, they were starting to get a little bit unsure on that account. But anywho, sacrifices to this deity were widespread and common. The population was deemed irreversibly corrupt, and the 331st Cadian Imperial Guard Regiment was tasked with the painstaking duty of eradicating all deviant human life on the planet, without destroying the planet as well, so they'd have to do it the good old-fashioned way, rather than deploying any of those newfangled cyclonic torpedoes to take care of the populace and the planet. The Sons of Malice, of course, were unable to intervene in this process and could not rescue their home world's population, stuck as they were within the Eye of Terror, one of the most heavily guarded areas of space in the entire galaxy. Getting out of there is no easy feat. So for the time being, the Sons would have to satisfy themselves with swearing oaths of eternal vengeance upon Cadia and all its people. Though, interestingly enough, when the Sons arrived in the Great Eye, they didn't immediately get along with its usual inhabitants. Now, usually when a Space Marine chapter turns renegade or is outcast for the Imperium for one reason or another, they are quite quickly forced to make, at the very least, temporary alliances with the heretical warbands nearby, lest they find themselves the only female rabbit in a cage stuffed full of 1,000 male rabbits. But the Sons of Malice had other things in mind. Instead of accepting the seemingly inevitable, bending over, grabbing their ankles, and accepting their position as the freshest bundle of grapes in the orchard, they started attacking anyone and everyone nearby. If a warband sent a delegation to them, the Sons of Malice would gun them down mercilessly. They would attack transport ships, enemy strongholds, they would raid recruiting centers, and even force the neophytes of other warbands, at the threat of a bolt gun, to join the Sons of Malice instead. To put it quite bluntly, the Sons had been given the option of the two Bs, being bitches or bullies. And they had resoundingly chosen option number 2. Still, this should not be taken as the Sons of Malice fully rejecting chaos. No, quite the opposite, in fact. Now that they were free of the undoubtedly rather limiting constraints of the Imperium, they could embrace their delights to a degree that they had never even dreamt of. they became some of the most twisted and horrifying of all Chaos Space Marines. But it was not, again, in the service of Chaos itself. Instead, they became an odd mix of a surprisingly Codex-compliant chapter, with the only differential being that they employed 11 companies rather than 10, which puts them closer to the Codex Astartes than the Space Wolves. Just to point that out, by the way. And yet, at the same time, they also fully embrace the wide array of mutations that now racked their bodies. They did not yet entirely understand what was happening, or, well, maybe some of them did, but certainly not all. The previous captain of the first company, Cathal, has since risen to the position of chapter master, and it is suggested that he was the one that initiated a long-time new tradition. Every 100 years, the entire chapter would gather, but not anymore, on their home planet. Instead, they would do so on the Labyrinth, an ancient vessel of war abandoned by the Sons as a temple of sorts. It became their most holy place now that they were bereft of their home world, and they initiated a set of trials. Whilst every single battle brother would be called back to the Labyrinth each 100 years, they would also bring along with them slaves, with each brother bringing one to contribute to the total. With 11 companies, and presuming that scouts, neophytes, etc. Probably would not be allowed to attend, we are looking at 900 to 1,000 odd so slaves, again taking into account battlefield casualties, etc. These slaves would then be put in a communal pool and divvied up amongst the battle brothers, each of them receiving one slave, not necessarily humans, mind you, after which each brother retreats to a private quarter and eats the slave. Thereafter, as another part of the ritual, some of the Sons will choose to venture into the deepest reaches of the Labyrinth, which have been deliberately left unguarded, open, and uncovered by Gellerfields within the eye. You can imagine the kinds of interesting creatures bumping around in the darkness there. The trial consists of the Space Marines attempting to travel through the Labyrinth's hallowed halls, eventually ending up with a single survivor that will then join the chapter's elites. This is not the case. It is a ruse, presumably put in place by the now chapter master Cathal. Instead, the survivor of the trial will be turned into a sacrifice. And after many such rituals, finally, 11 sacrifices had been gathered. 11, incidentally, being the sacred number of Malice, who was then, through yet another ritual, summoned into reality, and then passed on his plans for the reconquest of Skelos to the chapter master. This certainly has some interesting implications. The idea of summoning a chaos god seems extremely far-fetched, but it does fit in not with Malice's backstory, but with Malal's backstory. A clear hint that Malice is supposed to be Malal, but in a bit more of a, well, legal way. We'll get to that near the end. Or alternatively, it is also possible that Malice is not a chaos god at all, but merely an exceptionally powerful demon entity, which would explain his ability to manifest, at least for limited periods of time, within the material world. It would also explain why he seems to have a bit more in the way of individuality about him, whereas the other Chaos Gods, by and large, are avatars of their emotions and their aspects. After this, the Sons of Malice continued to engage in open warfare with other Chaos forces, but they did now partake in a much grander alliance alongside Abaddon the Despoiler, and they even engaged in combat alongside other Chaos warbands. Most famously during the Battle of Faith's Anchorage. This happened after the fall of Cadia, gone but not forgotten, where the Sons of Malice deployed alongside several other warbands. The Sons of Slaughter, the Crimson Slaughterers, Black Legion, and up to 5 other formations as well. Clearly, the Sons' vows of revenge against the Cadians were more important than their stance against Chaos. Unfortunately for the Sons, whilst they did manage to wipe out the Cadian presence at first near Faith's Anchorage, a second flotilla of Cadians, along with a Space Wolf vessel, eventually appeared in system, destroying much, if not indeed most, of the Chaos flotilla and driving it off, ending the battle with an Imperial victory, though it is not clear how many of the Sons were killed in the engagement. And this roundabout is where the tale of the Sons end. They haven't been overly heavily featured in the background lore so far, for various reasons, which again we will get to. They've been a part of a novel or two and a short story, and they've been given brief little anecdotal mentions in some of the codexes. So they are canon, it's just that they were probably more the individual initiative of a writer, who then Games Workshop looked at it and went, we can probably get away with this, but don't push our luck. And I mention that because I have been referencing Malal, haven't I? Malal and Malice are, technically and legally speaking, not the same entity, not the same Chaos God, and not the same intellectual property. Malal is the really old school Chaos God, who was, again, a Chaos God of anti-chaos. By far his most famous appearance and champion is, as I mentioned, all the way back in Old Hammer with Caleb Dark and his lovely little petrodactyl axe that ate Chaos Worshippers' powers. And boy, look at that stat line. Weapon skill and ballistic skill of 9. Boy knows how to swing that petrodactyl head, and no doubt about it. This was a little bit of a general thing behind the worshippers of Malice. You can also see there up to the top right and the left corner, that black and white skull. Yes, that's awfully reminiscent of something else we've been seeing today, isn't it? It's pretty much literally Malice's symbol. Subtle. Very subtle indeed. But the general idea and trend was that Malal had very few followers. It was when a Chaos Worshipper fell to desperation, fell to self-loathing and self-hatred, where he looked back upon his life, say, as a loyal Sigmarite, and then looked at what he had become and felt disgusted with himself. Look what Chaos has done to me. I hate Chaos. I loathe it. And that was at the point when they would turn to Malal. And by and large, these would be the most powerful of all Chaos champions, simply because they had followed the Chaos ladder to its logical conclusion. They had gotten as far in the service of the ruinous powers as they possibly could, and then come to resent themselves both for what they had become and for what the journey had been. Now, I would love to delve a little bit deeper into Malal's lore specifically, but two things. One, this was before I was even alive, so I don't have that much in the way of first-hand knowledge, sadly. And second, there really wasn't all that much lore about him that we could consider fitting in with today's Warhammer. Again, this was back when there was actually several other Chaos God as well, including Zuvasin and Neku. Now, these two gods also, in a kind of very, very, very technical way, exist. Kinda. Slightly. Each of them are mentioned, as far as I'm aware, in a single Age of Sigmar story each, and even then, it is indications and circumstantial evidence, more like Easter eggs rather than Games Workshop saying like, oh yeah, no, these are totally still things. By the way, Zuvasin is probably my favorite because he is the god of the impossible, essentially. Whenever you come up with any kind of concept, any kind of plan, any kind of like firm idea, and you go, right, this is what's going to happen, then Zuvasin is going to step in and go, and is going to make the impossible happen instead. Literally. He is the kind of god where if you jump off a roof and say, well, there's only one option from here, it's going down, he'll launch you into the firmament and laugh all the bloody way. I do kind of like him. I imagine he would create some very interesting Chaos Warbands and characters. Whereas Neku, I want to just say Neko. Okay, you know what? That's fine. Neko, the Chaos God, is the Chaos God of paradoxes. And he/she, because, you know, both things at once, was intended to kind of be the doomsday switch for the universe, the Ragnarok thing. Because Neko is, of course, paranormal. She is supernatural. She is a god. And yet, simultaneously, she is the god of contradictions. She is the god that says, no, the supernatural doesn't exist. I am not supernatural. I am not a god, because that is the paradox. That is the essence of the god's being. And therefore, at some unknown point in a distant future, this would cause a giant poof, and all of the Chaos Gods would be wiped out in a paradoxical explosion. But despite this, Neko was not the most hated and feared of these gods. Oh no. That was Malal, and by hated and feared, I mean hated and feared by the forces of chaos and the ruinous powers. Neko was an inevitability, something that would eventually happen, but it could happen at the heat death of the universe for all anybody knew. Malal, however, was an actively hostile chaos entity that would do everything within his power to interfere with and destroy the ruinous powers. This, of course, put him kind of on the side of the good guys in the Warhammer Fantasy setting, albeit not really. He wasn't fighting against chaos for any particular reason. He wasn't trying to protect mortals or save their silly little inconsequential lives or do any good like that. He didn't give a shit. This was his nature. He is a creature of anti-chaos, and therefore he will fight against chaos. He needs no other rationale or reasoning, just like corn needs no other rationale or reasoning to chop people's heads off. But GW, of course, has a far more rational reason for why he's no longer around or utilized. Now, this is where we enter into a little bit of mythical territory here, but There are suggestions that Malal was once intended to be a pretty major player in 40k as well. Rumors, for example, that he might be the mind behind the Tyranids, or that he was going to get his own chaos demons. I do believe I have seen mention of sketches of Malal monsters which were supposedly produced by Games Workshop, but I haven't really been able to confirm that, so, grain of salt, but I do think that Malal would have been a very interesting entity in 40k lore, but I don't know if he would really fit. The idea of a chaos god against the other chaos gods feels like he would probably be used more like a bit of a deus ex machina more often, rather than a truly interesting character. The four ruinous powers already interfere with one another near constantly, and having another god just do that, but in a different color and slightly more obnoxiously, well, maybe, who knows. But the reason for why Games Workshop isn't actually using Malal has got nothing to do with the story implications. Instead, it is due to far more legalistic reasons. Way back during the mists of time, you see, GW was a much smaller and poorer company. Equally greedy, but smaller and poorer. And so apparently they had hired a pair of authors by the name of John Wagner and Alan Grant, not as actual employees, but as de facto freelancers. And they were the ones that came up with the concepts of Caleb Dark, double A's, and Malal, his master. And because they weren't technically working for GW at the time, GW does not technically have any legal claim to either of the characters. That still rests with the authors, who, to the best of my knowledge, has never really done anything with Malal or Caleb. Though, at the same time, I can't shake the feeling that I've seen Malal in a Judge Dredd comic at one point, I swear. Something about his six-fingered hand is ringing a bell in the back of my mind saying, I've seen this somewhere, and I know that one of them, was it John? Has been writing Judge Dredd for quite a time, which is another, of course, pretty damn awesome setting. But again, legally speaking, Malal is their property. They, I believe, entered into a shortly lived legal dispute with Games Workshop, basically saying that if you ever use Malal again, we are either going to sue you, or you are going to have to pay us royalties. And GW never really has. They've hinted at it, and so far no real issue has been made of it. Though, again, if you were to try and argue that Malal is malice, etc., there is certainly plentiful circumstantial evidence, but I certainly wouldn't take it to court. Especially also as, there was another legal incident as well. Because Caleb Dark, well, he's drawn a bit more than a hint of inspiration from another character that has been a little bit in the spotlight as of late for having been Control-C'd and Control-V'd on more than one occasion. Michael Moorcox Elric. By the way, incidentally, the ideas of chaos and order in 40k and Warhammer are also, I wouldn't say wholesale lifted from Moorcock's work. I wouldn't go quite that far, but they certainly have drawn inspiration, particularly when it comes to the Chaos Star, which is, in certain instances, they have literally copied it precisely. It's a little bit of an irony, is it not, that a company as vociferously aggressive and eager with their own IP, they frankly started out essentially as a parody in many ways of other people's IP. If you look back at the really, really old Warhammer stuff, again, you'll see more than a pinch of borrowing. And finally, I'd like to wrap the video up with a little bit of a theory crafting discussion on the Sons of Malice. Again, I believe they were probably a author's one-off inspiration. Perhaps having read through some of the old stuff, he figured, you know, that Malal thing sounds awfully cool. Let me kind of do that, but with enough difference so as to not get my bosses sued. And GW gave the thumbs up, thinking like, okay, this is a cool little nod to the old lore. Go ahead, dear sir. But were the Sons of Malice actually heretical traitors? Well, on the first count, yes, they were heretics. Already before they were sent off into the Eye of Terror, their rituals, and I'm not talking about the eating part, again, that can be part of wholesome loyalist rituals as well, as demonstrated by the Mortifactors, but their obsession with the number 11 in conjuncture with their cannibalistic habits, that indicates that, yes, they were probably already, maybe indirectly, but certainly in some way, worshipping Malal. Otherwise, that would be one hell of a coincidence. I guess you could argue, theoretically, that they might be from the 11th Legion Astartes, which would be kind of fun, because that, of course, is one of the lost legions, the expunged ones. I did also see a theory floating about that supposedly Horus had been talking about one of his lost brothers with the words like, Mal, something like that, but he was apparently being choked out psychically by Malkador at the time. You know, Malkador, his nickname, so I certainly would not call that any kind of a real indicator, other than perhaps, again, a neat little Easter egg, perhaps. But on the second question, you might be thinking, well, they're heretical traitors, right? We've made sure of that. Well, we've made sure that they are indeed heretics. That's correct. But does that necessarily and unconditionally make them traitors to the Imperium? Now, if you ask the Inquisition, then the answer is yup, exterminators all the way. But what is an enemy? If they were perfectly happy fighting for the Imperium up until this point, and there was no real indication that they wouldn't remain happy to keep fighting for the Imperium, and even after being excommunicated they still fought the forces of chaos, is that not an indicator that if they had simply just been left alone, they would be counted as a loyalist chapter even to this day? Regardless of whether or not their true loyalties may have lain in a somewhat different direction? Honestly, I'd probably say yes. But then again, I'm not quite as pure, I guess, as the Inquisition might want. Oh my. Dangerous wrongthink there in the extreme. But on that little theoretical note, I shall wrap up this video. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.